The most dangerous mistake in a room is assuming you already know who the smartest person is. The statement would not be spoken until much later that evening, but by the time it was said, nobody in the restaurant would ever forget it. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows of the Harbor Room, one of Seattle's most respected waterfront restaurants. The city lights shimmered across the dark water beyond the glass, creating reflections that danced like liquid gold. Inside, executives in tailored suits filled the private dining area reserved for a special corporate gathering. Laughter rose and fell between conversations about acquisitions, investments, and market forecasts. At the center of the room sat Nathan Brooks, the 43-year-old billionaire founder of Brooks Technologies. To the business world, Nathan represented success. His company employed thousands across the country. Financial magazines featured his face on their covers. Investors followed his decisions with almost religious attention. Yet at that moment, Nathan appeared less interested in the conversations around him than in the young girl seated beside him. Sophie Brooks, 10 years old, was attempting to finish a school project while waiting for dinner. A stack of papers rested beside her plate. Colored notes and handwritten questions covered every page. Nathan glanced down and smiled. "Still working?" Sophie nodded. "My presentation is next week." "You have had 3 weeks." "I know. Then why are you finishing it tonight?" Sophie grinned. "Because I am my father's daughter." Several executives laughed. Nathan shook his head in surrender. Across the room, Claire Bennett moved quietly between tables carrying trays of drinks and appetizers. At 28 years old, she had mastered the art of becoming nearly invisible when necessary. Her dark apron was neatly pressed. Her movements were efficient. Her smile was polite but reserved. Most customers barely noticed her beyond taking orders and delivering meals. Claire preferred it that way. Attention had never interested her. Observation did. While conversations unfolded around her, she listened, not intentionally, simply because years of restaurant work taught her how much people revealed when they believed nobody was paying attention. Near the entrance, Trevor Kane leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man who enjoyed hearing his own opinions. As vice president of Brooks Technologies, he never missed an opportunity to remind others of his status. His voice carried easily across the room. "I still say schools make things too complicated," he announced. "Half the information kids learn will never matter." Several people nodded politely. Sophie looked up from her project. "That is not true." Trevor smiled indulgently. "And why is that?" Sophie flipped through her notes. "Because understanding how things connect matters." Trevor laughed. "That sounds impressive, but let me ask you something." He pointed toward one of the questions on her paper. "If knowledge is so important, explain why civilizations with the most information sometimes make the worst decisions." The table fell quiet. Sophie stared at the page. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Nathan watched her struggle. For once, she seemed genuinely stuck. Around the room, executives exchanged amused glances. It was not a cruel question, just an unexpectedly difficult one for a 10-year-old. Sophie lowered her eyes. "I do not know." Trevor smiled as though he had proven a point. At that exact moment, Claire arrived beside the table carrying fresh coffee. She froze for half a second after hearing the question. Then she carefully placed the cups down. Her expression remained calm. She had no intention of speaking, no intention of drawing attention to herself. But something about the disappointment on Sophie's face made her hesitate. For the first time that evening, the quiet waitress looked directly toward the table. And before she could stop herself, she softly said, "Because information and wisdom are not the same thing." The words hung in the air far longer than anyone expected. Claire immediately wished she had remained silent. She lowered her eyes and reached for the empty coffee pot, hoping to continue her work unnoticed. But the room had already changed. Conversation stopped. Several executives turned toward her. Even the sound of silverware seemed to fade. Sophie looked up first. Her disappointment vanished, replaced by curiosity. "What do you mean?" she asked. Claire hesitated. She was not accustomed to speaking in rooms like this. People in expensive suits usually wanted efficient service, not philosophical discussions from a waitress. Yet Sophie was looking at her with genuine interest. Nathan noticed it too. The girl was leaning forward as though she had just discovered the most interesting person in the restaurant. Claire took a slow breath. "Information tells people what happened," she said softly. "Wisdom helps people understand why it happened and what they should do next." The room remained silent. Trevor folded his arms. That sounds clever, but it does not really answer the question. Claire nodded respectfully. Maybe not completely. Trevor smiled slightly, confident again. Then explain. Claire looked towards Sophie instead of Trevor. Think about history. Some societies had incredible libraries, advanced science, and access to knowledge. They knew many things. But knowledge alone does not stop fear, pride, or greed. People can possess information and still make poor choices. Wisdom is knowing how to use information responsibly. Sophie stared at her notes. Then her eyes widened. So information is like having a map. Claire smiled. Exactly. Sophie continued. And wisdom is knowing where you should actually go. For the first time, Claire laughed softly. That is a much better way to say it. Nathan watched the exchange carefully. Something about Claire's answer felt different. It was not simply intelligent. Many intelligent people filled the room. It was the way she explained a complicated idea so naturally that a 10-year-old could understand it. That required a different kind of skill. Across the table, several executives exchanged glances. One quietly nodded. Another leaned back in thought. Trevor, however, appeared unconvinced. Interesting theory, he said. Did you study philosophy? The question carried an edge. Not openly rude. Just enough to remind everyone that Claire was supposed to be serving dinner, not participating in discussions. Claire shook her head. Not formally. Trevor raised an eyebrow. Then where did you learn that? For a moment, a shadow crossed her face. It disappeared almost instantly. From listening. The answer surprised everyone. Trevor looked skeptical. Listening. Claire adjusted a water glass on the table. People reveal a lot when they talk. Teachers, customers, parents, children. Sometimes the best lessons come from paying attention. Nathan found himself smiling slightly. It was such a simple answer. Yet it felt remarkably true. Sophie looked down at her project again. She scribbled something onto one of her note cards. Then she looked back at Claire. Can I ask another question? Trevor chuckled. Careful. She is supposed to be working. Nathan finally spoke. His voice was calm, but firm. I think one more question will not hurt anyone. Claire froze for a second. The billionaire's eyes met hers for the first time that evening. There was no arrogance in them. No amusement. Only curiosity. Genuine curiosity. Sophie smiled eagerly. Good. Because there is one question nobody at school could answer. Not even my teacher. Claire held the coffee pot quietly against her apron. Something told her the evening she expected to be ordinary was about to become anything but ordinary. Claire should have walked away. Every instinct told her to refill the coffee cups, return to the kitchen, and let the evening continue without her. Yet Sophie was looking at her with such hopeful curiosity that leaving felt impossible. The young girl flipped through several pages of notes before stopping at one highlighted question. Here, she said. This is the one. Claire glanced down briefly. The question seemed simple at first. Then she read it again. Why do some people become wiser after failure, while others become bitter? Around the table, a few executives smiled. Others looked thoughtful. Trevor leaned back in his chair. Now that is a better question. Sophie nodded. My teacher said there is no single answer. Nathan watched quietly. Unlike the others, he seemed less interested in whether Claire could answer and more interested in how she would approach it. Claire rested the coffee pot against her. Sighed. Your teacher is right, she said. There is no single answer. Trevor smirked slightly, as if expecting her to stop there. Instead, Claire continued. But I think it begins with what people believe failure means. Sophie tilted her head. What do you mean? Claire looked toward the rain beyond the windows. Some people see failure as proof that they are not good enough. Others see failure as information. The room grew still again. Sophie immediately grabbed a pen. Information? Claire nodded. Imagine touching a hot stove. Several people smiled. You get burned. The experience hurts. But the lesson teaches you something useful. The pain is temporary. The knowledge stays. Sophie wrote quickly. So failure teaches? Sometimes. Claire smiled. If someone is willing to learn. Trevor folded his arms. And if they are not? Claire met his gaze politely. Then the lesson repeats. A few executives exchanged amused looks. Nathan lowered his eyes briefly, hiding a smile. Trevor was not accustomed to being answered so directly. Sophie seemed fascinated. Then why do some people become bitter? Claire thought for a moment. Because learning requires humility. The answer landed differently. Several conversations around nearby tables had quietly stopped. Even people who were not part of the dinner had begun listening. Claire did not seem to notice. Nobody enjoys being wrong, she continued. Nobody enjoys failing. But growth usually begins the moment someone says, I still have something to learn. Nathan's expression changed slightly. The words appeared to reach him on a personal level. Claire could not know that the billionaire had spent the last 3 years rebuilding his life after losing his wife. She could not know how many mistakes, doubts, and difficult lessons had followed. Yet somehow her answer felt strangely relevant. Sophie looked up from her notes. So wisdom is not avoiding mistakes. Claire shook her head. No. Wisdom is understanding what the mistake is trying to teach you. Silence followed. Not awkward silence. The kind that appears when people are thinking. Sophie slowly smiled. That is the best answer I have heard. Trevor glanced toward Nathan. Interesting. Nathan finally spoke. More than interesting. Claire immediately looked uncomfortable with the attention. She reached for the empty coffee cups. I should get back to work. But before she could step away, Nathan asked a question of his own. Miss Bennett, he said calmly, how much education do you have? The entire table looked toward her. And for the first time that evening, Claire hesitated before answering. For a moment, Claire simply stood there holding the empty coffee cups. The question itself was not offensive. Nathan had asked it with genuine curiosity. Yet something in her expression suggested the answer carried a history she rarely discussed. Around the table, people waited. Sophie looked especially interested. Trevor appeared almost eager. Claire finally smiled faintly. Not as much as people usually assume. Trevor leaned back. That is a diplomatic answer. Claire nodded. I attended the University of Washington for 2 years. Several eyebrows lifted around the table. Trevor looked surprised. Nathan remained quiet. Sophie smiled. What did you study? Claire glanced at the girl's notes. Several things. Sophie laughed. That is not a real answer. Claire laughed softly too. No, I guess it is not. She set a cup onto her tray. I started with economics. Then I became interested in psychology. Then history. Then education. Trevor shook his head. That sounds unfocused. Claire accepted the criticism without reacting. Maybe it was. Nathan studied her carefully. Did you graduate? The question was gentle. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. No. The answer seemed to settle over the table differently than anyone expected. Not because dropping out of college was unusual. Many successful people had done the same. It was the way she said it. There was no bitterness. No embarrassment. Just acceptance. Sophie looked disappointed on her behalf. Why not? Nathan immediately glanced at his daughter. You do not have to answer that if you do not want to. Claire appreciated the kindness. For a moment she considered ending the conversation there. But something about the evening felt strangely safe. My mother became ill. She said. Someone needed to take care of her. Nobody spoke. The rain continued tapping softly against the windows. So I left school and started working full-time. Sophie looked down at her papers. Did you ever go back? Claire smiled. Life became busy. Trevor folded his arms again. That was a long time ago. Claire nodded. Yes. Then how do you remember so much? She considered the question. Because I never stopped learning. Trevor frowned slightly. Nathan, however, looked more interested than ever. What does that mean? Claire adjusted the tray in her hands. Most people think education only happens inside classrooms. She glanced toward the books visible on Sophie's project. Classrooms are important. Teachers are important. But learning can happen anywhere if you stay curious. Sophie immediately nodded. I like that. Claire smiled. My mother loved libraries. Every week, she would bring home books. History, science, biographies, literature. She used to say curiosity costs nothing. Nathan looked toward the rain-covered harbor outside. Something about that sentence seemed to stay with him. Curiosity costs nothing. In a room filled with people who measured value through numbers, it sounded unexpectedly profound. Trevor cleared his throat. Still, reading books is different from real expertise. The comment carried enough challenge to make several executives uncomfortable. Claire merely nodded. That is true. Trevor smiled. Then perhaps Nathan should ask something harder. Sophie immediately looked excited. Yes. Nathan laughed quietly. You seem very eager to turn this into an interview. Because she keeps giving good answers. Nathan looked back at Claire. For the first time all evening, he was no longer seeing a waitress standing beside the table. He was seeing a mind. And that realization made him ask the question that would change the direction of the entire night. Nathan rested his hands on the table and looked directly at Claire. Unlike Trevor, he was not searching for a weakness. He was searching for understanding. "All right," he said calmly. "Here is something I have wondered for years." The room became quiet again. Sophie immediately put down her pen. Even several executives at neighboring tables appeared interested. Nathan leaned back slightly. Why do intelligent people often disagree about the same facts? A few heads nodded. It was not a simple question. In business, politics, economics, and everyday life, people constantly reach different conclusions while looking at identical information. Claire considered the question carefully. She did not answer immediately. Nathan noticed that. Most executives he knew rushed to speak. Claire seemed to think before every word. Finally, she said, "Because facts rarely exist by themselves." Trevor frowned. "What does that mean?" Claire glanced toward the harbor outside. The rain continued falling beyond the glass. Facts are pieces of reality, but people interpret those facts through their experiences, fears, values, and goals. Sophie immediately began writing. Nathan listened closely. Claire continued. "Imagine two people standing on opposite sides of the same mountain." She paused. "Both describe what they see honestly. Neither is lying. Yet their descriptions may sound completely different." Sophie looked up. "Because they see different sides?" "Exactly." Claire smiled. "The mountain has not changed. Their perspectives have." Trevor shook his head. "That sounds like a way of saying everyone is right." Claire gently shook her head. "No. Some conclusions are still better supported than others." Trevor folded his arms. "Then what is the solution?" Claire answered almost immediately. "Curiosity." The simplicity of the answer caught everyone off guard. Nathan raised an eyebrow. "Curiosity." "Yes." Claire adjusted a water glass that had drifted slightly off-center. Most arguments become destructive when people stop trying to understand and start trying to win. Several executives exchanged glances. More than one looked uncomfortable. Claire did not appear to notice. "Curiosity forces us to ask what we might be missing." Sophie smiled. "Like looking at the other side of the mountain." "Exactly." Nathan found himself impressed again. Not because the answer was brilliant in a technical sense. It was because she could transform complicated ideas into something clear enough for a child to understand without making it feel simplistic. That skill was rare. Very rare. Trevor tapped the table. "Let me ask something more practical." Nathan glanced at him. Trevor leaned forward. "If curiosity is so important, why do so many successful people stop being curious?" The question carried an edge. Several people recognized it immediately. Trevor was no longer testing ideas. He was testing Claire. For the first time all evening, the atmosphere shifted. Claire noticed it too. Yet her expression remained calm. She thought for a moment before speaking. Because success can be dangerous. The room fell silent again. Nathan's attention sharpened instantly. Trevor looked surprised. "Dangerous?" Claire nodded. "Success creates confidence. Confidence is valuable. But if confidence becomes certainty, people stop asking questions." Nobody interrupted. And the moment someone believes they already know everything worth knowing, Claire continued softly, "they stop growing." The words landed heavily across the table. Nathan lowered his eyes for a second. Sophie stared at Claire with admiration. Trevor said nothing. And for the first time that evening, several executives were no longer looking at Claire as a waitress standing beside their table. They were looking at her as the most thoughtful voice in the room. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The rain outside continued its steady rhythm against the windows, but inside the harbor room, the atmosphere had shifted completely. What began as casual conversation now felt like something else entirely. Nathan glanced around the table. Many of the executives who usually dominated discussions were listening more than speaking. That alone was unusual. Claire seemed unaware of the effect she was having. She simply stood beside the table holding her tray, waiting politely as though she expected the conversation to end at any moment. Sophie broke the silence first. "I wish you were my teacher." The comment made several people laugh. Claire smiled. "Trust me, you do not." Sophie frowned playfully. "Why not?" "Because I would probably give too much homework." Sophie immediately groaned, and for the first time in several minutes the table relaxed. Nathan watched the exchange with quiet amusement. His daughter rarely connected with strangers so quickly, yet something about Claire's calm intelligence seemed to put her at ease. Trevor, however, appeared increasingly uncomfortable. The attention in the room had gradually shifted away from the executives and toward a waitress. It was not a situation he enjoyed. Let us be realistic, Trevor said. Interesting conversations are one thing. Expertise is another. The remark immediately changed the tone again. Claire remained calm. I agree. Trevor looked surprised by the response. You do? Of course. Claire nodded. There are countless things I do not know. Nathan noticed the answer instantly. No defensiveness. No ego. Just honesty. Trevor pressed forward. Then perhaps people here are giving too much weight to your opinions. Claire considered that. That is possible. The response caught him off guard again. Several executives smiled into their coffee cups. Trevor seemed frustrated by how impossible she was to provoke. Nathan leaned forward slightly. Then let me ask something different. Claire turned toward him. All right. Nathan folded his hands. What do you think is the most valuable skill someone can develop? Sophie looked excited immediately. Trevor appeared relieved. It sounded like a safer question. Claire thought for several moments before answering. The ability to learn without feeling threatened. Silence followed. Nathan's expression changed. Trevor frowned. Sophie blinked. What does that mean? Claire looked toward the young girl. Imagine someone tells you that you are wrong. Sophie nodded. Nobody likes that. Exactly. Claire smiled. Most people immediately defend themselves. They stop listening. Several executives shifted slightly in their seats. More than one appeared personally attacked by the observation. Claire continued gently. But if someone can stay curious instead of defensive, they gain something valuable. Nathan looked intrigued. And what is that? A chance to improve. The answer was simple. Yet once again it carried unexpected weight. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. The world changes constantly. New information appears every day. The people who continue growing are usually the people willing to admit they still have things to learn. Nathan found himself thinking about his own company. The most successful leaders he knew shared exactly that trait. Not certainty. Curiosity. Sophie smiled. I like that answer. Trevor sighed quietly. You seem to like all of her answers. Because they make sense. Trevor had no response. Nathan looked toward Claire again. The more she spoke, the more puzzled he became. She did not sound like someone who had merely read a few books. She sounded like someone who had spent years thinking deeply about life, people, and ideas. And for the first time all evening, Nathan found himself wondering not what Claire knew, but what circumstances had hidden someone like her behind a restaurant apron for so many years. Claire should have returned to the kitchen 20 minutes ago. The dinner rush was continuing throughout the restaurant. Orders moved between tables. Glasses clinked softly. Waiters crossed the dining room, carrying trays. Yet somehow the conversation at Nathan's table had become the center of attention. Not because people were trying to listen, because they could not help listening. Sophie certainly could not. She had completely abandoned her school project. Her notebook now contained pages of handwritten observations inspired by Claire's answers. Can I ask one more? Sophie said hopefully. Claire laughed softly. You have asked that several times already. That means yes. Nathan shook his head with amusement. You negotiate like a lawyer. I learned from watching you. Several executives laughed. Nathan pointed toward his daughter. See what I have to deal with every day? Sophie grinned. Then she turned back toward Claire. What is the difference between being smart and being wise? The question seemed simple. Yet even Trevor looked interested. Claire considered it carefully. Being smart helps you solve problems. Sophie nodded. Okay. Being wise helps you decide which problems are worth solving. For a moment, nobody spoke. Nathan slowly leaned back in his chair. Trevor blinked. Sophie stared at her notebook. That is a really good answer. Claire smiled. There are many good answers. But that one makes sense. Nathan found himself studying Claire again. The remarkable thing was not the intelligence itself. It was the clarity. She never spoke to impress people. She spoke to help them understand. That distinction mattered. Across the business world, Nathan had met countless brilliant people. Many seemed determined to prove how intelligent they were. Claire never appeared interested in proving anything. Trevor finally broke the silence. You keep answering philosophical questions. His tone remained polite, though slightly challenging. But real life is different. Claire nodded. Of course. Then let me ask a practical question. Nathan glanced toward him. Trevor continued. Suppose two people work equally hard. One succeeds. One fails. Is that fair? Several executives looked intrigued. Sophie frowned thoughtfully. Claire took longer than usual before responding. No, Trevor seemed surprised. No. Life is not always fair. Claire's voice remained calm. Sometimes people begin with advantages. Sometimes they face obstacles others never see. Sophie lowered her pen. Nathan listened carefully. Claire continued. Hard work matters. Character matters. Responsibility matters. But pretending everyone starts from exactly the same place is not honest. Trevor folded his arms. Then success is mostly luck? Claire shook her head immediately. No, then what is it? Claire looked around the table. A combination of opportunity, effort, choices, timing, and sometimes luck. Several executives nodded quietly. Nathan noticed that even the people who disagreed with parts of her answer seemed to respect the thoughtfulness behind it. Sophie smiled. That sounds complicated. Claire laughed softly. Most true things are. The young girl stared at her for a moment. Then she asked a question nobody expected. Were you supposed to become something else? The room fell completely silent. Claire froze. Nathan immediately recognized the change in her expression. For the first time all evening, the answer seemed difficult. Not intellectually difficult. Personally difficult. Sophie looked worried. You do not have to answer. Claire remained quiet for several seconds. Then she looked toward the rain-covered harbor beyond the windows. A faint smile appeared on her face. Once, she said softly, I thought I would. And suddenly Nathan realized there was an entire story hidden behind those few words. The question lingered over the table long after Claire spoke those 4 words. Once, I thought I would. Nobody rushed to fill the silence. Even Trevor seemed unsure what to say next. Sophie lowered her pen and looked at Claire with genuine concern rather than curiosity. Nathan noticed the difference immediately. His daughter was no longer interested in the mystery. She was interested in the person. Claire looked down at the tray in her hands before setting it gently on an empty chair beside the table. For the first time all evening, she seemed less like someone answering questions and more like someone remembering a different life. When I was 19, she said softly, I thought I would become a teacher. Sophie's eyes brightened. Really? Claire nodded. That was the plan. Nathan listened carefully. The rain outside had become lighter now, the harbor lights reflecting across the dark water beyond the glass. You wanted to teach? Sophie asked. More than anything. Claire smiled faintly. I loved learning. I loved helping people learn. It seemed like the perfect combination. Trevor tilted his head. Then what happened? Claire was quiet for a moment. Life happened. The answer was simple, but Nathan sensed there was much more behind it. Claire continued before anyone could ask another question. My mother became sick during my 2nd year at the university. At first, everyone believed it would be temporary. Her smile faded slightly. Then temporary became permanent. The room remained completely still. She could not work anymore. Medical bills started arriving. There were appointments, medications, things that needed to be paid for. Sophie slowly lowered her eyes. Claire continued calmly, without self-pity. Someone had to make practical decisions. So I left school. Nathan found himself wondering how many people would have made the same choice at 19. Probably fewer than liked to imagine they would. Did you regret it? Sophie asked quietly. Claire thought about the question longer than any previous one. Sometimes. Then she smiled gently. But not because I helped my mother. Sophie nodded. Because you lost your dream? Claire looked toward the harbor again. For a while, yes. Nathan watched her expression carefully. There was sadness there, but there was also peace. The kind of peace that only comes after years of accepting something difficult. And your mother? Sophie asked. Claire's smile softened. She passed away 3 years ago. No one spoke. The words settled over the table with unexpected weight. Trevor lowered his eyes. Several executives stared quietly at their coffee cups. Nathan felt something shift inside him. He knew what it meant to lose someone whose absence changed every part of life. Claire continued before the silence could become uncomfortable. After that, I kept working. 1 year became another. Then another. She laughed softly. Life has a way of moving faster than you expect. Sophie looked disappointed on her behalf. But you still love learning. Claire smiled. Every day. Nathan noticed something remarkable. Despite everything she had sacrificed, there was no bitterness in her voice. No resentment. Only gratitude for what remained. And in that moment, he realized the most surprising thing about Claire Bennett was not her intelligence. It was the fact that hardship had made her wiser instead of harder. For the first time that evening, nobody seemed interested in asking another question. The conversation had moved beyond curiosity. It had become something more personal. Sophie stared quietly at her notebook. Nathan looked toward the harbor lights beyond the windows. Even Trevor appeared less certain of himself than before. Claire reached for her tray again, clearly intending to return to work. I should probably get back to my tables, she said with a polite smile. Sophie immediately frowned. Already? Claire laughed softly. Believe it or not, I do have a job. That earned a few smiles. Around the table, Nathan glanced toward the dining room. Other customers were finishing meals. Servers moved between tables carrying dessert plates. The evening was continuing as normal for everyone except the people sitting there. Thank you for answering all our questions, Sophie said. Claire nodded. You asked good ones. You gave better answers. Claire shook her head. The quality of an answer usually depends on the quality of the question. Sophie quickly wrote that sentence down. Nathan noticed. Another note? Definitely. Sophie grinned. That one is going into my presentation. Claire looked surprised. I am not sure your teacher will appreciate being quoted by a waitress. Before Sophie could respond, Trevor spoke. That is exactly the problem. The comment immediately changed the atmosphere. Claire remained calm. Nathan slowly turned toward Trevor. What problem? Trevor folded his hands. People are becoming emotionally attached to this story. Nobody answered. Trevor continued. She seems intelligent. I agree with that. But intelligence is easy to admire when there are no consequences. Sophie frowned. Nathan watched quietly. Claire said nothing. What are you trying to say? Nathan finally asked. Trevor leaned forward. I am saying it is easy to sound wise in a restaurant conversation. Running a company is different. Leading people is different. Solving real problems is different. Several executives looked uncomfortable. Trevor was speaking more directly than before. Knowledge is one thing, he continued. Results are another. Claire listened without interruption. Nathan noticed she showed no sign of anger, no defensiveness, no resentment. Trevor looked toward her. You said life is complicated. Fine. Then answer this. The room grew still again. Trevor's voice remained polite, but everyone could hear the challenge beneath it. If intelligence and wisdom are so important, why are brilliant people often unsuccessful? Sophie immediately looked concerned. Nathan watched Claire carefully. He expected her to take time before answering. Instead, she responded almost immediately. Because intelligence is not the same as discipline. Trevor blinked. Claire continued calmly. And wisdom is not the same as action. Silence followed. Trevor frowned slightly. Claire met his gaze respectfully. Many people know what they should do. She paused. Far fewer people consistently do it. Several executives nodded before they realized they were doing it. Nathan hid a smile. Claire continued. Success usually requires more than talent. It requires patience, consistency, humility, resilience, relationships, timing. She glanced around the table. And sometimes it requires surviving circumstances that have nothing to do with intelligence. Nobody spoke. Trevor leaned back in his chair. For the first time all evening, he seemed unable to find a response. Nathan looked at Claire differently now. Not because she had won an argument. She never seemed interested in winning. What impressed him was that every answer revealed the same pattern. She understood people. And suddenly Nathan realized something important. The most valuable thing hidden behind that restaurant apron was not education. It was perspective. A perspective earned through years of observing life from a place most powerful people never bothered to look. The challenge should have ended there. Trevor had asked his question. Claire had answered it. Most people would have considered the discussion complete. Yet something about the evening refused to settle. Nathan could feel it. So could everyone else at the table. The conversation had reached a point where nobody was merely exchanging opinions anymore. They were revealing how they saw the world. Trevor glanced around the room and noticed the attention Claire had gathered. Executives who usually spoke only about business were listening to a waitress. The realization clearly bothered him. Fine, he said. Let us try something more concrete. Nathan remained silent. Sophie looked curious again. Claire waited politely. Trevor leaned forward. Our company recently spent 6 months debating a major expansion project. We had analysts, consultants, forecasts, and market research. Half the room supported the decision. Half opposed it. Everyone had data. He paused. If smart people can look at the same information and reach opposite conclusions, how is a leader supposed to decide? Several executives immediately recognized the situation. It was a real problem, one they had all faced. Nathan watched Claire carefully. This question was different. More practical. More difficult. Claire took a moment before answering. A leader should start by asking a different question. Trevor crossed his arms. Which is? Claire looked toward him calmly. What information would change my mind? The room became completely silent. Trevor frowned. Nathan's eyes narrowed with interest. Claire continued. Most people enter important decisions trying to confirm what they already believe. They search for supporting evidence. She glanced around the table. But strong leaders actively search for evidence that might prove them wrong. One executive quietly nodded. Another lowered his eyes toward the table. Nathan could almost see the idea spreading through the room. Claire continued. If no information can change your mind, then the decision is already made. At that point, data becomes decoration. Sophie's eyes widened. She immediately wrote the sentence down. Trevor opened his mouth, then stopped. Nathan recognized something unusual. Trevor was thinking. Really thinking. Claire went on. The goal is not certainty. The goal is understanding. Nathan found himself remembering board meetings, acquisitions, product launches, and countless moments when pride had disguised itself as confidence. Claire's answer felt uncomfortably accurate. And what if the evidence remains unclear? Trevor asked. Claire smiled softly. Then leadership becomes courage. Nathan raised an eyebrow. Explain. Claire looked toward him. Sometimes there is no perfect answer. No complete information. No guarantee. Her voice remained calm. Eventually, someone has to make a decision while accepting the possibility of being wrong. Silence followed. Not because people disagreed. Because they understood. Sophie slowly closed her notebook. That sounds scary. Claire laughed gently. It usually is. Nathan stared at her for several seconds. Then he smiled. Not the polite smile of a businessman. A genuine one. Because, after years of listening to experts, consultants, analysts, and executives, a quiet waitress had just summarized leadership more clearly than most corporate conferences ever managed to do. And in that moment, Nathan realized the most surprising thing about Claire Bennett was no longer that she knew so much. It was that she had somehow learned all of it without anyone ever noticing. The conversation should have ended after that. The dinner was nearly over. Dessert plates had begun appearing across the restaurant. Outside, the rain had softened into a light mist drifting across the harbor. Yet nobody at Nathan's table seemed eager to leave. Claire finally picked up her tray again. I really do need to get back to work, she said with a small smile. Sophie looked disappointed. You always say that right when things get interesting. Claire laughed softly. That is because your definition of interesting is very demanding. Nathan smiled. She gets that from her mother. For a brief moment, silence settled over the table. Sophie's expression softened. Nathan's eyes drifted toward the window. Claire noticed it immediately. She recognized the kind of silence that follows the mention of someone deeply missed. Sophie quietly looked down at her notebook. My mom used to say curiosity was important too. Claire's expression warmed. Then she sounds like someone I would have liked. Nathan looked back toward her. There was gratitude in his eyes. Simple gratitude. Nothing dramatic. Just appreciation for the kindness. Trevor glanced between them before speaking. You know what I find most surprising? Claire looked toward him. What? You do not seem angry. The question caught everyone off guard. Trevor continued before anyone could interrupt. You gave up school. You spent years caring for someone else. You lost opportunities. Most people would be resentful. Sophie frowned slightly. Nathan remained silent. Claire considered the question carefully. I was angry for a while. The honesty surprised everyone. You were? Sophie asked. Claire nodded. Of course. She smiled gently. I am human. Several people laughed quietly. Claire continued. When life changes, unexpectedly, disappointment is natural. Nathan listened closely. So what changed? Claire looked toward the harbor lights reflecting across the water. Perspective. The room grew still again. My mother used to tell me something. She paused. She said that grief teaches you what mattered, but gratitude teaches you what still matters. Nobody spoke. The sentence settled over the table with unusual weight. Nathan lowered his eyes briefly. Sophie slowly wrote the words into her notebook. Even Trevor remained silent. Claire continued. I could spend my life focusing on what I lost. Her voice remained calm. Or I could focus on what I was fortunate enough to have. Nathan felt the words more deeply than he expected. Since losing his wife, he had spent years balancing those same two perspectives. Loss and gratitude. Absence and memory. Claire looked toward Sophie. Your mother clearly taught you important things. Sophie smiled proudly. Nathan looked away for a moment, gathering himself. Then he turned back toward Claire. My daughter was right earlier. Claire tilted her head slightly. About what? Nathan smiled. You should have been a teacher. Claire laughed softly. Life had other plans. Maybe. Nathan studied her for a second. Or maybe life is not finished yet. The words seemed simple. Yet something in his tone made Claire pause. For the first time all evening, uncertainty appeared in her expression. Not because she feared the conversation, because she sensed it was leading somewhere unexpected. Nathan leaned back in his chair and looked at her thoughtfully. After hours of listening, observing, and asking questions, he had reached a conclusion. Claire Bennett possessed something his company searched endlessly to find. Intelligence, character, perspective, humility. And as the final coffee cups cooled on the table, Nathan began quietly considering a possibility that would change both of their lives far beyond the walls of that restaurant. Claire stood quietly beside the table, unsure how to respond to Nathan's last comment. Life is not finished yet. The words stayed with her. For years, she had learned not to expect dramatic changes. Most days followed the same rhythm. Early mornings, long shifts, conversations with strangers she would never see again. Small routines that kept life moving forward. Dreams belonged to an earlier chapter, or at least that was what she had convinced herself. Nathan glanced at his watch before looking back toward Claire. The restaurant had begun to empty. A few remaining customers lingered over coffee and dessert. The evening was slowly coming to an end. How many nights a week do you work? He asked. Claire seemed surprised by the question. Usually 5 or 6. Nathan nodded. And when you are not working? Claire smiled faintly. Reading. Sophie laughed immediately. I knew it. Claire looked amused. Was it that obvious? A little. Sophie tapped her notebook. Nobody answers questions like that without reading a lot. Nathan smiled. What are you reading now? Claire hesitated. A biography. Trevor raised an eyebrow. Of who? Abraham Lincoln. Several executives exchanged glances. Trevor seemed almost disappointed that the answer sounded perfectly normal. Nathan chuckled quietly. Why Lincoln? Claire considered the question. Because he was willing to change his mind. The answer immediately captured Nathan's attention. Claire continued. People remember strong leaders for being confident. But many of the best leaders spent their lives learning, adjusting, growing. Nathan nodded slowly. That is true. Sophie looked at her father. You like books about leaders too. I do. Claire smiled. Then we have something in common. For a brief moment, the conversation felt unexpectedly easy, natural, as though none of them occupied the roles that had separated them earlier in the evening. Billionaire, executive, waitress. They were simply people talking. Nathan leaned forward slightly. Claire, I would like to ask you something important. The table grew quiet again. Claire looked uncertain. All right. Nathan folded his hands. Have you ever considered returning to school? Sophie immediately looked excited. Trevor looked surprised. Claire blinked. Recently. Nathan nodded. Yes. Claire laughed softly, almost nervously. Not seriously. Why not? She looked down. For a moment. Because life costs money. Nobody spoke. Claire continued. Because responsibilities do not disappear. Her smile remained gentle. Because eventually you stop believing opportunities like that still exist. Nathan listened carefully. Then he reached into his jacket and removed a business card. He placed it on the table between them. Claire looked confused. Sophie looked thrilled. Trevor stared silently. Opportunities still exist, Nathan said. Sometimes they simply arrive later than expected. Claire looked at the card without touching it. The logo of Brooks Technologies rested in the center. Beneath it was Nathan's direct contact information. And in that moment, she realized the evening was no longer leading toward a conversation. It was leading toward a decision. Claire stared at the business card long after the dinner ended. She almost convinced herself it had been a polite gesture. The kind successful people made when a conversation left an impression. Yet 3 days later, an email arrived. Then a phone call. Then an invitation. Nathan was serious. He did not offer charity. He did not offer sympathy. He offered opportunity. The months that followed became some of the busiest of Claire's life. She returned to school part-time through a program Nathan helped connect her with. She attended classes in the evenings. She continued working while studying. She read during early mornings and late nights. The pace was exhausting. Yet for the first time in years, she felt herself moving towards something instead of simply moving through time. Nathan kept his promise. He never treated her like a project. He treated her like a person whose abilities deserved room to grow. Sophie remained her biggest supporter. Every few weeks, messages would arrive asking what book Claire was reading or what class she enjoyed most. Their friendship continued naturally, built on curiosity and mutual respect. 1 year later, sunlight poured through the windows of a conference center overlooking Seattle's waterfront. Rows of professionals filled the room. Educators, business leaders, students, community organizers. The event focused on lifelong learning and leadership. Claire stood quietly behind the stage curtain, waiting for her turn to speak. The microphone clipped to her jacket suddenly felt heavier than it should. She smiled to herself. Some things never changed. Public speaking still made her nervous. Across the room, Nathan and Sophie sat together in the audience. Sophie, now 11, waved enthusiastically when she spotted Claire. Nathan laughed softly and shook his head. Claire waved back. The event host stepped onto the stage. "Our next speaker has a remarkable story," he announced. Not because her life was easy, but because she never stopped learning. Applause filled the room. Claire walked onto the stage. For a brief moment, she looked out across hundreds of faces. A year earlier, she had been carrying coffee through a crowded restaurant. Now she stood before an audience waiting to hear her thoughts. The contrast felt surreal. Yet she remained the same person. She adjusted the microphone and smiled. "Good afternoon." The room became quiet. Claire looked across the audience before continuing. "People often ask when my life changed." She paused. The truth is, it did not change in a single moment. Nathan listened carefully. Sophie smiled proudly. "It changed every time I stayed curious instead of giving up. Every time I kept learning instead of assuming it was too late." The audience listened in silence. Claire's voice remained calm. "Many people believe opportunity belongs to the lucky. Sometimes it does. But opportunity also belongs to the people who remain ready when it finally arrives." The room erupted into applause. Nathan glanced toward Sophie. She looked happier than he had seen in months. Claire smiled as the applause continued. 1 year earlier, she thought her story had already been written. Now she understood something different. Life does not always reward the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it quietly waits for the person who never stopped growing. And often, the people the world overlooks are the very people capable of changing it.